Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into one of history's most compelling races, the sprint to be the first person to reach the geographic South Pole. We're talking about Roald Amundsen and his incredible expedition.
It really is. It's a story just filled with daring, intense planning, and some absolutely crucial decisions. We're going to unpack the strategy, the secrets, and, the sheer grit that propelled Amundsen and his team there.
And just weeks ahead of Robert Falcon Scott's British expedition.
Exactly. And understanding why their outcomes were so vastly different is a huge part of the story, isn't it?
It really is. Our source material for this deep dive comes primarily from a really detailed account of Amundsen's journey. It gives us a lot to work with.
Yeah, and our mission here is to pull out the absolute most important nuggets, the key decisions, the surprising facts, the insights buried in the details that really explain Amundsen's success against all the odds.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start maybe by setting the scene a bit. We're squarely in what historians call the heroic age of Antarctic exploration.
Right. Think of it as this period, late 19th into the early 20th century. It was fueled by national pride, a real thirst for scientific discovery, and this kind of overwhelming drive to plant flags in the last completely unknown places on Earth.
And Antarctica was the big one, the final frontier, sort of.
Definitely. And Amundsen emerges from this, but with a uniquely Norwegian background, right? Born in 1872, he was immersed in sailing and cross-country skiing from a young age, skills that turned out to be incredibly practical for polar work.
Pivotal skills, you'd have to say.
Absolutely. His early experiences weren't just skill building, they were survival lessons. He was the mate on the Belgian Antarctic expedition ship.
The one that got stuck in the ice.
That's the one. They were forced to spend the first ever involuntary winter down there, trapped
In the ice for a whole Antarctic winter. That sounds absolutely brutal.
Oh, it was harrowing for many on board. But Amundsen, our source notes, was different. He apparently remained dispassionate, recording everything. He basically used it as an intense education in polar survival. What worked for diet, clothing, techniques, he was learning constantly.
Turning misery into a crash course.
Yeah.
Smart. And then he really made his name leading the GA expedition, didn't he?
Yes, that was from 1903 to 1906. He successfully navigated the Northwest Passage for the first time, a huge achievement.
Massive.
Yeah, that feat immediately established him as a leading polar explorer on the world stage. By 34, he was a national hero in Norway, right in the top tier.
Which leads us to his initial grand plan. Because he wasn't originally aiming for the South Pole at all, was he?
No, not at all. His widely publicized goal was a long Arctic drift. Very different. He intended to use Fridtjof Nansen's incredibly famous polar ship, Fram.
Manson gave him permission to use it. That must have been huge.
Oh, massive. And the idea was to let Fram freeze into the Arctic ice near Siberia and hope the currents would carry them across or, close to the North Pole.
And Fram was specifically designed for this, right?
Yeah.
I remember reading Colin Archer built it with that unique rounded hull.
Exactly. So the ice pressure wouldn't crush it, but lift it up instead. Nansen said it would slip like an eel.
Deliver.
A brilliant piece of engineering for the time. And Amundsen's plan, using Nansen's ship, it was well regarded, funded partly by the government and private donations. Everything seemed set for the Arctic.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, though. Everything changes with a headline.
That's right. In 1909, news broke that American explorers Frederick Cook and then Robert Peary both claimed to have reached the North Pole. Bang, bang.
And those claims were highly disputed, even back then, weren't they?
Oh, very much so. And they still are today, really. But for Amundsen, whether they were true or not almost didn't matter in that moment.
How so?
It was, as our source describes it, a potential death blow to his Arctic plans. The primary geographical objective, being first to the North Pole, was suddenly off the table, at least in the public's mind and for his funding.
Right. The glory was gone, or seemed to be. So facing the loss of his funding and public interest, he pivoted. Hard.
He did. He saw one way to save the expedition: change targets to the South Pole. Shackleton had gotten incredibly close just a few years earlier, remember, within 97 nautical miles.
So close.
Yeah, and Amundsen saw that as having left a little corner, still unconquered, as he put it, an opportunity.
But he kept this new South Pole goal an intense secret.
Almost completely. Initially, apparently only his brother Leon and his second-in-command, Prestrud, knew the real plan.
Wow. That must have taken some nerve.
It did, and this secrecy later drew heavy criticism, especially in Britain. It was seen as, well, underhand.
Why the extreme secrecy, though? What was the calculation?
He felt it was absolutely essential to secure the necessary funding first, and crucially, to prevent interference. He was worried the Norwegian parliament might even try to stop him, maybe to avoid offending the British and Scott, who had already announced his South Pole plans very publicly.
Okay, so political and financial reasons mainly.
Pretty much. Ultimately, Nansen gave his blessing to the switch, which was vital support for Amundsen. He needed Nansen on side.
Right. And the source mentions he even dodged Scott when Scott was in Norway testing his motor sledges. Amundsen just refused to take his call.
Yeah, apparently so. Just avoided the conversation altogether. The revised plan was very specific. Sailed directly to the Bay of Whales on the Great Ice Barrier, or the Ross Ice Shelf as we call it now.
And this was a strategic masterstroke, wasn't it? Because it put their base like 60 nautical miles closer to the pole than Scott's planned base at McMurdo Sound.
Exactly. A significant head start built right in.
But Shackleton had been concerned the ice there might be unstable, hadn't he?
He was, yeah. But Amundsen studied the records, Shackleton's included, and he came to believe it was actually grounded on underlying shoals or islands, making it a secure, stable location for a base camp, Framheim.
Oh, was he right?
Well, his theory about the grounding wasn't entirely accurate, we know that now, but for their purposes, for the couple of years they needed it, it proved perfectly stable. It held up.
Okay, let's talk about preparation. Amundsen's approach sounds incredibly thorough. It wasn't just about having gear. It was about having the right gear and the right people.
Absolutely. He understood that success hinged on meticulous preparation. The selection of his team was key. He wanted experienced, compatible companions, people who had proven themselves in harsh conditions already.
Like Olav Bjaaland.
Exactly. Bjaaland was a champion skier and a brilliant carpenter, invaluable for modifying sledges later on. Then you had Helmer Hansen and Sverre Hassel, the dog experts, Oscar Wisting, a real all-rounder.
And his absolute reliance on dogs was central, wasn't it? A defining feature.
Completely non-negotiable for him. He ordered 100 top-quality North Greenland sledge dogs. He wrote later that he couldn't comprehend the apparent aversion of some British explorers to using dogs effectively.
Interesting. Why the difference?
Well, for Amundsen, dogs were simply the most efficient and proven method of transport for the huge distance involved in Antarctica. It was pragmatic.
He focused on specific equipment adaptations, too. Our source mentions specially designed ski boots he'd worked on for 2 years.
Yeah, 2 years perfecting boots. And layered clothing using traditional proven materials like sealskin and reindeer skin. Practical stuff.
Not experimental.
No, exactly. Sturdy sledges made of Norwegian ash with hickory runners, extra long skis designed to bridge crevasses just in case, robust tents that could be put up easily even in a blizzard, and the reliable Swedish Primus stove, crucial for cooking and melting snow for water.
And keeping everyone healthy was paramount.
Yeah.
Scurvy was this huge threat on polar expeditions back then, even if they didn't fully understand the vitamin C connection yet.
Right. Amundsen knew from the Belgica that fresh meat helped prevent it, so they relied heavily on fresh seal meat as the base.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, supplemented by things like bottled cloudberries and blueberries, surprisingly high in vitamin C and wholemeal bread. They even had a special pemmican made with vegetables and oatmeal mixed in.
Covering all the bases. And this detail really stands out. Unlike some expeditions that seem to embrace hardship, Amundsen made sure morale was high. He brought a library of 3,000 books.
3,000. And a gramophone, records, even musical instruments.
That's amazing.
He learned from the tough winters on the Belgica. Keeping spirits up during months of darkness was just as critical as the physical preparation. It was all part of the plan.
Even with all this planning, things were tight financially before they even left Norway. Amundsen actually had to mortgage his house.
He did, yeah. Just to fund the final stages. He was personally invested to an enormous degree. His financial ruin was literally tied to the expedition's success.
Wow, so the pressure was immense. Now, on the way south, after they'd taken the dogs aboard, they stopped in Kristiansand. And there was this crucial intervention, wasn't there?
Yes, a Norwegian expatriate living in Argentina, Don Pedro Christofferson, made this incredibly generous offer to provide fuel and provisions when they reached Buenos Aires.
A lifesaver, presumably.
Oh, absolutely. A crucial lifeline that Amundsen gratefully accepted. But the true destination, the South Pole Switch, that was finally revealed to the entire crew much later.
Where was that?
In Madeira, in September 1910.
How did he tell them? Must have been an intense moment.
He gathered them together and framed it as a detour to the South Pole on their way to the Arctic. He put it to a vote, apparently.
Yeah.
All the men agreed to continue south. which really shows the trust and loyalty he'd built with his core team, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it was from Madeira that he sent that famous, almost curt telegram to Scott.
That's the one. Beg leave to inform you, Fram proceeding Antarctica. That was it.
Wow. Talk about minimal.
No details about his destination within Antarctica, of course. Back in Norway, this revelation caused a huge stir, mostly negative initially. Nansen's warm approval helped counter that eventually, but funding dried up almost completely. He really was on his own financially after that.
And the British reaction you mentioned earlier, the private reactions.
Definitely negative among certain circles. Figures at the Royal Geographical Society, the RGS, privately called it a dirty trick. But Amundsen was already sailing south by then, largely unaware of the full uproar back home or in Britain.
So Fram reached the Bay of Whales in January 1911.
Yep.
And they got straight to work.
Immediately. No time to waste. They scouted the location, found a suitable spot a couple of miles in from the ice edge, and started unloading the prefabricated hut sections, supplies, dogs, everything. Built Framheim base hut, and started hunting seals for the winter meat supply, about 200 of them.
And then, talk about a surprise meeting. Just a few weeks later, Scott's ship, Terra Nova, just shows up in the Bay of Whales.
Can you imagine the shock for both sides? Terra Nova had dropped Scott and his main party at McMurdo Sound and was exploring the eastern edge of the barrier, looking for a potential landing spot for a secondary party when they just stumbled upon Framheim.
It must have been a real moment of realization for the British team on board, seeing the Norwegians already established and 60 miles closer to the pole.
Oh, absolutely. A huge psychological blow, you'd think. Though the meeting itself, by all accounts, was civil. Officers visit each other's ships, exchanged pleasantries.
Amundsen must have been relieved about one thing.
Yes. Immensely relieved to discover Terra Nova had no wireless radio. This preserved his plan, his hope, to be the first to transmit the news of success back to the world.
Did he worry about Scott's expedition at all after that meeting?
He was definitely worried by the reports from the Terra Nova officers that Scott's experimental motor sledges seemed promising. That was a nagging concern.
Right, the unknown factor.
Scott's officer Campbell politely declined Amundsen's perhaps slightly mischievous offer of a base site nearby and headed back to report the unsettling news to Scott. Meanwhile, Amundsen's team focused on the absolutely critical work of laying supply depots.
Okay, explain the depots. Why were they so vital?
These depots, caches of food and fuel placed out on the ice barrier, were absolutely vital. They allowed the Polar Party to travel lighter initially, knowing they could resupply on the way south and, just as critically, on the way back. Less weight means faster travel.
Makes sense.
They undertook two main depot journeys in February and March 1911, pushing south as far as 82 degrees south latitude.
And they cached seal meat, paraffin, biscuits, dog food.
Exactly. All carefully calculated amounts. Conditions varied wildly on those journeys. Initially quite good, but then temperatures plummeted, sometimes down to -40 Celsius. And the surface, rough sastrugi snow ridges, made pulling the sledges incredibly hard work.
These were also shakedown cruises in a way, right? Testing the gear, the men, the dogs. Lessons learned.
Definitely. They quickly realized the initial sledges they had were too heavy for the job. That needed fixing over winter. And they figured they'd need even more dogs for the final push to the pole than perhaps first thought.
And this is also where the first significant cracks appeared within the team.
Yes. Hjalmar Johansen, who was a very experienced Arctic explorer, but perhaps felt overshadowed and was only included at Nansen's strong request. He openly criticized the equipment during the second depot journey, complained about the skis, other things.
Which Amundsen perceived as a challenge to his leadership.
Precisely. Amundsen was running a very tight ship, very focused. Any hint of insubordination or public questioning of his authority was seen as undermining the whole endeavor, the discipline needed, seeds of conflict there.
Then came the long winter at Framheim. Months of polar night. Must have been tough.
From late April, yeah. No sun for 4 months straight. But Amundsen, clearly remembering the morale issues he'd seen on the Belgica, made sure the team stayed busy. Idleness was the enemy.
Lots of crucial work happened during that time, didn't it? Modifying gear.
Absolutely. Jalin, the skier and carpenter, was a star. He spent hours modifying the old sledges, making them lighter, and building completely new ones specifically designed for the polar plateau conditions, using spare hickory wood they'd brought. Ingenious work.
And Johansen, what was his task?
Johansen was assigned the, perhaps slightly tedious but essential task of preparing all the rations for the polar journey, counting out thousands of biscuits, weighing and packing pemmican. Others were fixing boots, tents, checking harnesses, all the gear, constant activity.
And staying healthy was still a focus, right? Prevent scurvy.
Oh, yeah. They ate frozen seal meat twice a day, plus those precious bottled cloudberries and blueberries they'd brought from Norway, and wholemeal bread, all unknowingly helping prevent scurvy.
Despite the routine and the work, Amundsen himself was worried.
Hassel recorded in his diary that Amundsen was really tormented by worries about Scott's motor sledges. He kept thinking about them. He feared the British might gain a significant speed advantage with this new technology.
And that fear pushed him to try and start the polar journey incredibly early, didn't it? Against advice.
Yes. As soon as the sun technically returned in late August, Hjalmar Johansen, with his Arctic experience, warned him strongly it would be far too cold out on the barrier at that time of year. Animals couldn't take it.
But Amundsen, driven by his worry about Scott, overruled him.
He did. Which brings us to the second season and what turned out to be a serious, nearly disastrous false start.
Right. On September 8, 1911, they set off. 8 men, 7 sledges, 52 dogs. Full of optimism initially.
But Johansen's warning proved tragically accurate almost immediately. Conditions were horrific. Temperatures just plummeted to minus 58 degrees Celsius, 58 below freezing.
Unbelievable cold.
Dogs' paws froze almost instantly on the snow. It was almost impossible for the men to rest or stay warm when they stopped, even for a short time. Frostbite was setting in.
Amundsen quickly realized the mistake, didn't he?
Yeah, thankfully. After just a few days, he was unwilling to risk lives for what he now knew was a rash decision. Driven by fear rather than good judgment, he ordered everyone back to Framheim.
But the return journey itself was brutal.
It was chaotic and brutal. Several dogs froze to death on the way back. And in the rush to get back to the relative safety of the hut, Amundsen and some of the fitter men, pushing hard, raced ahead.
Leaving others behind.
Effectively, yes. Johansen and Christian Prestrud were left struggling behind with a weaker dog team, and crucially, without adequate food or fuel for their stove. They were in real danger.
They arrived back at Framheim much later, didn't they? Completely exhausted and suffering from frostbite.
Yes. And this led directly to a major confrontation. The simmering tension boiled over.
Yeah, Hansen let loose.
He was furious, and probably rightly so. He confronted Amundsen publicly, accused him of abandoning them, and harshly criticized his leadership for the whole premature start fiasco. It was apparently quite a scene.
How did Amundsen react to that public challenge?
Swiftly and severely. He saw this outburst as violently insubordinate, a direct challenge that undermined his absolute authority, which he felt was essential for discipline and success.
So there were consequences, serious ones.
Oh, yes. The consequence was Johansen was completely excluded from the main polar party. He was basically demoted and reassigned to lead a much less significant secondary exploration group along the coast under a far more junior officer. A real humiliation for Johansen. And the polar party itself was reduced to 5. Amundsen, Helmer Hansen, the lead dog driver, Olav Jolland, the ski expert, Sverre Hassel, and Oscar Wisting. A smaller, perhaps more cohesive, and definitely more obedient unit after that incident.
So after waiting for conditions to actually improve, for the temperatures to rise, the real dash for the pole finally began.
Yes, they waited until mid-October. Much more sensible. They set off properly on October 19th, 1911. The chosen 5 men, 4 sledges, and 52 dogs.
Were there immediate challenges this time, or smoother sailing?
Well, almost immediately, in dense fog a few days out, they strayed into a dangerous crevasse field. Wisting's sledge, which Amundsen happened to be riding on at that moment, very nearly plunged down a hidden crevasse.
Close call.
A very near miss, yeah. Shook them up, but they pressed on.
And they kept moving forward, marking their route systematically.
Yes. Every 3 miles or so, they built snow cairns, flagged with dark material so they could find their way back easily. Essential navigation. On November 17th, they reached the edge of the Great Ice Barrier and finally faced the massive Transantarctic Mountains, the next big hurdle.
Unlike Scott, who used Shackleton's known route up the Beardmore Glacier, Amundsen had to find his own way through this huge mountain range.
That's right, a totally unknown path.
And he did. They scouted around and discovered this steep, dramatic glacier about 30 miles long, winding its way up towards the high polar plateau.
He named it the Axel Heiberg Glacier, after Axel Heiberg, one of his main private financial backers. A bit of necessary flattery, perhaps.
And the ascent? Was it difficult?
Oh, it was a tough climb. Very steep in places, lots of detours needed to avoid impassable ice falls, struggling through deep snow sometimes. But the dogs were just incredible. They pulled the sledges up 5,000 feet in a single day at one point. Just amazing animals.
Incredible power.
Yeah. They reached the summit of the glacier, the edge of the plateau, over 10,600 feet up, on November 21st.
And this summit became known by a rather grim name, didn't it? The Butcher's Shop. Why?
It sounds grim, but it was a stark but necessary reality of their dog-based strategy. Of the 45 or so dogs that made the incredibly strenuous ascent, they had planned all along to kill a large number at this point. They only needed enough to pull the reduced loads across the plateau and back down.
How many did they kill?
All but 18, so 27 dogs were killed there. This provided crucial food, fresh meat for the remaining 18 dogs, and, importantly, for the men themselves for the final push.
That must have been incredibly difficult for the men who worked so closely with them.
Amundsen wrote about it, acknowledging the depression and sadness in the air. We had grown so fond of our dogs, but the cold, pragmatic need for sustenance and logistical efficiency was paramount to the plan's success. Wisting, in particular, became skilled at preparing the dog meat quickly and efficiently.
So with the remaining 18 dogs pulling 3 lighter sledges, they moved onto the polar plateau itself. What was that like?
Another challenging landscape, actually. Not just flat snow, it was often crevassed, icy ground underneath a thin snow layer. Amundsen called one particularly treacherous area the Devil's Glacier, and another, where hidden crevasses gave way under hollow-sounding snow bridges, the Devil's Ballroom.
Sounds nerve-wracking.
Definitely kept them on edge. Despite that, though, they made excellent progress, pushing south, generally covering good distance each day on the high plateau. Better than expected. Often.
And they passed Shackleton's farthest south record.
Yes, they passed Shackleton's point of 88 degrees 23 yards south on December 8th, a big milestone for them.
As they got closer and closer to the pole itself, were they constantly scanning the horizon? Worried Scott might somehow have gotten there first using those motor sledges.
Absolutely. That worry never completely left Amundsen. Every distant, dark object on the horizon caused a moment of alarm. He mentions one time something looked like a marker flag, but it turned out to be just their own dogs' droppings, magnified weirdly by a mirage.
The tension must have been immense.
Incredible. The day before they arrived, December 13th, they camped just 15 miles or so from the calculated position of the pole. So close.
And then, after months of planning, secrecy, hardship, and that final dash, the moment of victory.
Yes. December 14th, 1911, around 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Amundsen, skiing slightly ahead as the leader, was the first to arrive at the spot their calculations indicated was the geographic South Pole.
What was that moment like? Did he describe it?
The symbolic act, of course, was planting the Norwegian flag firmly in the snow. They also put up a small silk flag from the Fram. They named the vast, icy polar plateau surrounding them King Haakon VII's Plateau after their monarch.
And Amundsen, who had dreamed of the North Pole his whole life since childhood, found himself standing victorious at the South Pole instead. The irony.
He reflected on that irony himself in his writing, saying something like, "Could anything be more crazy?" But he didn't just celebrate and turn back. Learning from the bitter dispute surrounding the Cook and Peary claims for the North Pole, he was absolutely meticulous about confirming their position.
Right, he didn't want any doubt cast on his achievement. How did they verify it?
They spent 3 full days at the pole, taking repeated sextant readings of the sun at different times of day to fix the exact location with as much certainty as possible with the instruments they had.
3 days just taking measurements.
Yeah. And Bjaaland, Wisting, and Hassel even skied out about 10 miles from the calculated spot in different directions, sort of boxing the pole, just to ensure they had definitely bracketed the precise geographical point within their measurement area. Very thorough.
And they left a message, didn't they? A sort of calling card.
Yes, they erected their spare tent, which they named Polheim, home at the pole. Inside, they left some spare equipment, a few instruments, and crucially, a letter addressed to King Haakon of Norway, along with a short note for Scott.
Asking Scott to deliver the letter for them.
Exactly. Acknowledging Scott would likely arrive later and asking him to forward the main letter to the king. A confirmation, in a way, that they were first.
Getting to the pole was one massive achievement, but the race wasn't truly one, you could argue, until they got back safely and broke the news to the world first.
Exactly right. The return journey began just a few days later on December 18th. The determination was absolutely there to be the first back with the news, but they didn't race recklessly. They prioritized maintaining a sustainable pace, around 15 nautical miles a day initially, to preserve the strength of the men and the precious surviving dogs.
They even used the 24-hour daylight to their advantage in a clever way, didn't they? Traveling during the night.
Yes, they often traveled during the period that corresponded to night back home. This meant the low sun was usually at their backs, which significantly helped prevent the agony of snow blindness. Smart adaptation.
And those snow cairns they'd built on the way out, they must have been invaluable.
Absolutely crucial for navigation on the return across the vast, featureless plateau and barrier. They guided them directly back toward the depots and the top of the Axel Heiberg Glacier. They reached the butcher's shop relatively quickly, around January 4th, 1912, resupplied, and began the tricky descent.
Which I imagined was fast on skis for Amundsen and Bjelland.
Very fast for the steers. More precarious, though, for Helmer Hansen and Wisting driving the sledges down the steep, icy slopes. They actually had to improvise extra brakes, rigging ropes around the runners to help control the speed and prevent the sledges from careering into crevasses.
That sounds hairy. Once back on the flat of the Great Ice Barrier, their pace picked up considerably.
Oh, significantly. They were practically flying then, relatively speaking, often covering around 30 nautical miles a day, sometimes more, really pushing towards Framheim, eager to get back. The dogs knew they were heading home, too.
Yeah, they made it back safely, all 5 of them.
They did, an incredible achievement in itself. They arrived back at Framheim Base very early in the morning on January 25th, 1912, hugely relieved, utterly exhausted, but triumphant.
And the dogs. How many survived the whole round trip?
Of the 52 dogs that started the polar journey from Framheim back in October, 11 hardy animals survived, pulling the 2 remaining sledges back to the base. They had performed magnificently.
What an incredible feat of endurance and planning. The total journey sounds utterly exhausting just thinking about it.
It was monumental. 99 days round trip, covering about 1,860 nautical miles, or around 3,440 kilometers, and they returned in good health.
With the mission accomplished, Amundsen wasted absolutely no time, did he? He was focused on getting the news out.
No time at all. They loaded up Fram with the surviving dogs and the essential equipment and records, and left the Bay of Whales just 5 days later, on January 30th, heading for Hobart, Tasmania, the nearest telegraph station.
That was a long sea voyage in itself.
It was a 5-week voyage across the Southern Ocean, during which Amundsen meticulously prepared his official reports and carefully drafted the telegrams that would announce his world-shattering success.
They reached Hobart on March 7th, 1912. The tension on board Fram must have been enormous had Scott gotten there already, had news broken.
You can only imagine. But no, when they arrived, there was still no news from Scott's expedition. Amundsen immediately went ashore and sent brief, coded telegrams to his key contacts, his brother Leon, Fridtjof Nansen, and King Haakon. The next day, he cabled the full, detailed story to London's Daily Chronicle newspaper, to whom he'd sold exclusive rights.
Controlling the narrative right from the start. Very smart.
Absolutely. And while in Hobart, they even met Douglas Mawson, who was leading another major Antarctic expedition nearby. Amundsen generously gifted him his 11 surviving sledge dogs, which proved invaluable to Mawson's later survival.
That's a great detail. What were the initial reactions back home and around the world to Amundsen's news?
Initially, largely very positive, especially internationally. Congratulatory telegrams poured in from figures like former U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt and even Britain's King George V, who graciously noted with pleasure that Amundsen's first port of call announcing the news was on British soil in Tasmania.
And back in Norway. Pure celebration.
Oh, it was this huge moment of national pride. Flags everywhere, massive headlines, parades eventually. A special South Pole medal, the Sydpolsmedaljen, was struck for Amundsen and his team.
But you mentioned unease earlier.
Yes, our source notes that even amidst the celebrations, there was a chill underneath the cheers for some in Norway, a lingering unease about the initial secrecy and the perhaps ruthless efficiency of the tactics used to beat Scott.
And the British press reactions. Initially.
More restrained, understandably, but generally they admired the courage and determination shown. There was only really mild public criticism at first, focusing on him perhaps not informing Scott sooner or more directly about his changed plans.
But privately, within certain influential circles. Different story.
Yes, especially at the Royal Geographical Society, the reaction was much stronger and more negative behind closed doors. Figures like the old guard, Sir Clements Markham, privately called it a dirty trick. Some even initially questioned if Amundsen's claim was fraudulent, hoping Scott's return would somehow disprove it or put a different spin on it.
And Lord Curzon, the RGS president, later made that famous, slightly pointed comment about the dogs, didn't he?
He did, yes. When Amundsen eventually addressed the RGS in London, Curzon, in his introductory remarks, made a jocular but clearly pointed comment, proposing 3 cheers for the dogs, implying they deserved the credit, not necessarily Amundsen's planning. A definite slight.
It's interesting, though, that not everyone in Britain felt that way. Shackleton, Scott's rival, actually praised Amundsen, didn't he?
He did. Shackleton publicly called Amundsen perhaps the greatest polar explorer of today, acknowledging the sheer skill involved, a more generous perspective.
And it's worth just quickly mentioning the other successes of Amundsen's wider expedition, beyond the pole itself.
Definitely. While Amundsen was racing south, a smaller secondary party, led by Prestrud, the one left behind on the false start, ironically, successfully explored King Edward VII Land to the east, becoming the first humans to actually land and sledge there.
Important geographical work.
Yes. And Fram herself, under Captain Nilsson, conducted extensive oceanographic research on her voyages to and from Antarctica. They even had an unexpected meeting at sea with the Japanese Antarctic expedition ship, the Kainen Maru, so multiple successes.
The story takes a tragic and profound turn, of course, with the fate of Scott's expedition. When did Amundsen actually learn about Scott's death and the loss of his party?
Amundsen learned the terrible news in February 1913. He was actually on a lecture tour in the United States at the time, celebrating his achievement.
How did he react?
Reports say he was deeply affected, visibly shaken. His immediate reaction was apparently just repeating, "Horrible, horrible." He later gave a formal public tribute to Scott, calling him a man of honesty, for sincerity, for bravery, for everything that makes a man. Genuine respect there, it seems.
But Scott's death, and the way it happened, fundamentally shaped how the whole race to the pole was perceived afterwards, didn't it? Particularly in Britain.
Oh, absolutely. It changed everything. The Scott martyr myth grew incredibly quickly and powerfully. He was portrayed as this noble, almost saintly hero who, despite his valiant efforts and scientific ideals, tragically failed against overwhelming odds and perhaps less sporting competition.
And Amundsen, in contrast, was often cast negatively in that narrative.
Yes, very much so. He was often seen as merely a pragmatic, even cold professional who snatched the prize. His secrecy was framed as underhand, his reliance on dogs seen as somehow less noble than British man-hauling, and the necessary killing of dogs painted him as ruthless, a dog killer. It diminished his achievement in many eyes.
And Scott's own published journals, discovered with his body, really cemented that powerful narrative, didn't they? His final writings were incredibly moving.
Absolutely. They painted this incredibly powerful, eloquent picture of stoic British endurance against the elements, which resonated deeply. As one historian memorably put it, Scott's literary talent was his trump. It was as if he had reached out from his buried tent and taken revenge on Amundsen's victory narrative.
What happened to the other members of Amundsen's victorious polar party after they returned?
Well, Olav Jallen and Sverre Hassel largely retired from polar exploration after that, returning to quieter lives in Norway. But Helmer Hansen, the expert dog driver, and Oscar Wisting continued exploring with Amundsen on his later expeditions, including the Maud expedition through the Northeast Passage.
And Oscar Wisting holds this unique place in polar history, doesn't he?
He really does. He was with Amundsen at the South Pole and later flew with him over the North Pole in the airship Norge in 1926, making him one of the first, possibly the first, person to see both poles. And he even captained Fram on her final voyage. An incredible career.
And sadly, Hjalmar Johansen, the experienced explorer, excluded from the polar party after the confrontation. His story ended tragically.
It did, yes. He struggled greatly after returning to Norway. He couldn't really settle back into normal life, perhaps felt the injustice of his treatment keenly, suffered from severe depression and alcoholism, and tragically died by suicide in Oslo in January 1913. A very sad end for a brave, though perhaps difficult, explorer.
Modern historical perspectives have really reevaluated this whole period, haven't they? Both Scott and Amundsen.
Significantly, yes. The simplistic Scott martyr narrative has been challenged and largely dismantled by historians looking critically at the decisions made. While some revisionist views perhaps went too far in portraying Scott as just a heroic bungler, more nuanced understandings prevail today, acknowledging both his strengths and weaknesses.
And this reevaluation has brought renewed recognition for Amundsen's achievement, focusing on the factors behind his success.
Exactly. Historians now widely credit his victory to his superb, detailed planning, his deep personal experience, particularly his mastery of using dogs and skis efficiently, and his and his team's impressive physical stamina and discipline. His laser-like focus on the single geographical objective, using the most efficient, proven techniques available even when it meant difficult decisions like the butcher shop, was absolutely key to his success and, crucially, to bring his entire team back alive and well.
It feels very fitting then that today, the permanent United States scientific base at the South Pole, established back in 1957 during the International Geophysical Year, is named the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, honoring the memories and achievements of both men right there at the pole.
A perfect symbol of that shared history. Amundsen himself, of course, went on to other incredible explorations after the South Pole, the challenging Maud expedition attempting an Arctic drift, finally traversing the Northeast Passage, pioneering polar flights.
He was the first confirmed person to reach both poles, wasn't he? When he flew over the North Pole in 1926 in the airship Norge with Lincoln Ellsworth and Umberto Nobile.
That's right, an amazing life of exploration. Tragically, as we know, he disappeared in June 1928 while flying on a rescue mission in the Arctic, trying to find survivors from Nobile's crash airship Italia. A heroic end in its own way.
And modern research, using ice-penetrating radar, has even confirmed the location of that tent and flight he left at the South Pole back in 1911.
Yes, it's fascinating. Over 100 years later, research indicates the Polheim tent and the flags are still there, buried under about 17 meters, maybe 55 feet, of accumulated ice and snow. And due to the movement of the ice sheet itself, they've drifted slightly north, about a nautical mile or so away from the current marker at the precise geographic South Pole. Still there, under the ice.
Wow. Preserved.
So what does this all mean when we look back? Amundsen's expedition really stands as this incredible masterclass in practical planning, meticulous logistics, and the disciplined, expert use of proven polar techniques like dogs and skis. It was efficiency personified.
His singular, you could almost say ruthless, focus on achieving that one goal, getting to the pole first, even when it drew criticism for its secrecy and its sheer pragmatism, was ultimately the differentiator. It got him there first, and just as importantly, it brought all his men back alive.
It really highlights the different philosophies, the different approaches to polar exploration at the time, doesn't it? You had Amundsen's very professional, almost military-style, pragmatic pursuit of a specific geographical objective, versus Scott's broader aims, which included significant scientific research alongside the polar attempt, adding complexity and constraints, perhaps fatally so.
It leaves us with something to think about. Consider this. In the end, both Amundsen's and Scott's names are linked forever at the very bottom of the world at that shared station. Does the how of achieving a monumental goal, the methods used, the secrecy, the decisions made along the way, truly diminish the achievement itself? Or is the story of the journey, the safe return of the team, and the sheer mastery of the hostile environment perhaps just as important or even more important than simply being first?
That's definitely something for you to ponder as you keep exploring.